Welcome to St. John. Nothing Happened Here, with your hosts Greg Marquis and Mark Allen Green, a show all about a little city on the east coast of Canada where nothing ever happened. Except for this.
Today, in our quest for nothing, let's travel back in time to August 15th, 1854. The city has grown considerably since its inception 70-odd years ago. The waterfront is packed now with warehouses, there's factories of all kinds, and businesses. Fort Howe is long gone, but we see an old barn standing halfway up that hill, barely a shelter against the biting harbor winds. There are large slaughterhouses all along the inside harbor, pouring their waste, along with other industrial sludge, into a place aptly named Mill Pond. The pond is a cesspool, pervading the entire area with a stench that would stay in one's nostrils long after leaving its influence. The wealthy St. Johners live on a higher ground areas such as Queen Square, Mount Pleasant, and Chipman Hill. But of course, not everyone is wealthy. The poor of St. John are packed in the slum apartments that line York Point, around the west end of Union Street, close to Mill Pond, and the Strait Shore area of Portland, by the location of Fort Latour. Business is booming in St. John in 1854, largely due to demand for New Brunswick goods created by the Crimean War. Or at least it was. We look around now. The streets are deserted. The familiar clouds of smoke emanating from the factories are no longer there. Barely a ship to be seen in the harbor at one of the busiest times of day. Where has everyone gone? We smell smoke. Where there's smoke, there's fire, an old enemy that the city has confronted many times before and will again. But there is no fire, at least not a typical one. There are, however, hundreds of tar barrels burning everywhere in the middle of the streets. More white smoke pours from the windows of the decrepit apartments along the waterfront. We also catch a whiff of a pungent chemical odor. But still, no people. Then off in the distance, we hear horse hooves and heavily loaded wagon wheels rolling over the dry dirt road. The sound grows louder. Normally there would be hundreds of such vehicles coming together to form a consistent hum. But this cart is alone. We can see it now. It is weighed down by 4 crates, maybe 5, with a rider on top. Then we see. They're not crates. They're coffins. Our attention is turned from the grisly sight by a moan that cries out from inside a building. We slowly approach. There's an open window. We peer inside. We see what we think is a body long since dead. It's nothing but shriveled blue skin and bones. The eyes of the poor soul are sunk deep into its skull. But then it moves. One hand raises slowly, reflecting the pain of the slight movement. 2 fingers twitch in a spasm. The man gives out one last rattled breath as the black of his pupils widen for the last time. We look farther into the home through the window. More bodies are strewn about in similar states, possibly dead, possibly close to death. What has happened in St. John? The wind blows a few pieces of paper down the street. We pick one up as the others continue their directionless travel. We read it. It's a pamphlet printed by the Board of Health. One word catches our attention: cholera. We're in the middle of St. John's cholera outbreak of 1854, which proved to be the worst such 19th century outbreak in what would become Canada. August was the peak, with more than 40 people dying per day in a city of roughly 30,000. By the time it ends, The epidemic will claim approximately 5% of the entire population and forever scar those who survive the deadly disease. St. John, nothing happened here. Greg, again, things I never learned in history class. I had no idea about this cholera outbreak until I started doing research for my book. Let's talk about, how did cholera make its way to St. John?
Well, cholera was an international problem by the mid-1850s, so it came from Britain, but it had hit Britain coming from Asia originally, I think. So it was kind of a global disease that was being transmitted through shipping routes.
This was into the third pandemic. So the first pandemic of cholera would have been in 1817. This would have been the third international pandemic of cholera. And Britain was suffering from cholera in 1853, 1854. And St. John, it came to St. John on a ship. No surprise. It came on a ship called the Blanche from Liverpool in mid-April. Several deaths were reported aboard. So, and as soon as it hit Partridge Island, because that's where all the ships hit before they're allowed into port. So they inspect the ship and they go, yeah, there are a lot of passengers here in filthy state. This is the quote, in a filthy state. And passengers were required to quarantine on Partridge Island. So on April the 20th, cholera was identified on the island. And Lieutenant Governor Sir Edmund Head and Mayor James Olive at the time ordered precautions to be taken. And what kind of precautions were taken, Greg?
Well, these passengers were separated, which is as per the quarantine rules of the day. And the sick passengers were separated from the apparently healthy ones. Passengers were cleaned up. Their baggage was cleaned. I'm not sure we know the details. Yep. I'm not sure we know the details of what cleaning was back then. Open water or why. And then the apparently healthy passengers were allowed to go to shore. And by May 7th, over 270 passengers were clear, healthy, a clean bill of health, and 60 remained in quarantine, however.
Okay, so that's where it went bad. We'll learn about how cholera is spread, but allowing the apparently healthy passengers go on to St. John, that's where it probably went wrong as far as the communication of this disease. But eventually, everyone was allowed to leave because there was only one death on the island in that entire time. There were deaths on board ship, but as soon as it got to Partridge Island, there was only one death reported in August the 14th. So the passengers of the Blanche, of course, they were poor, right, Greg?
Yep.
They weren't wealthy passengers, and they went to the poorer parts of town, including York Point. And the first death, which we'll talk about later when we start understanding the understanding at the time of cholera, the first death was not actually a passenger of the Blanche. It happened on June the 23rd, and it was a policeman who lived close to where some of the passengers were housed.
Yeah.
In early July, the disease started to run rampant. And let's talk about the spread of the disease, Greg.
Yeah, well, the disease began to spread, and it seemed to hit all areas of St. John and Portland once it got going. But initially, it was those waterfront areas where poor people lived, low-lying areas. There was a thunderstorm in late July, and many thought that this would kind of clear the air because we'll talk about this later, maybe many experts at the time thought that these diseases were airborne, spread through air. And vapors, that type of thing. So the rainwater, but the rainwater may have made things worse by washing germs, which were unknown at the time, into low-lying areas. So it appeared
may have.
The first reported case seemed to be in Portland, which was the neighboring town that was north of St. John, which later became part of the north end of St. John. So sort of Fort Latour area. And then the Straight Shore, which is sort of now Chesley Drive area in St. John. And actually, the last recorded fatalities in Portland were also on Straight Shore in September. 2 children, one, their first names are not even recorded in the register, 10 and 12 years old, two boys. named McGoldrick, and then an adult named John Parker. So Portland, there are areas of Portland, much like St. John, where poor working class immigrant people lived, and these areas had the highest rates of sickness and fatalities.
Okay, so poor and low-lying areas, that's going to be important once we understand how cholera gets spread.
Yeah.
So at the height of the pandemic, so this is how bad it got, and this is absolutely staggering when we think about a town of or a city of 30,000 people, maybe. That's the population back then. So at the height of the epidemic, cholera was claiming 40 plus people per day. In July and August, people essentially abandoned the city. Everyone fled. So they either fled to the hills, so they fled to the woods. Can you imagine, Greg, St. John just emptied? It's a city. Yep. It has all the buildings and everything, and not a soul to be found unless you were suffering from cholera. Then you were left there to suffer alone. But it was just completely emptied. So you had some people going up into the hills, going into the woods. Others went on steamships to Fredericton. Now, of course, they were welcomed with open arms.
No.
No?
I mean, you can see the human nature there.
No, Greg.
Epidemic diseases in the nearby, and people are coming to your community. So, there were local population was quite upset, and special constables were enrolled to protect incoming river steamers from locals in Fredericton who might want to attack them, right? Concerned. I mean, well, just imagine what it was like. Remember what it was like when the pandemic was first breaking out in Canada? If you saw an out-of-province car.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So just imagine that in the 1850s, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Course, especially from an area that was known for having a huge COVID outbreak at the time. You go, BC, hey, get out of Alberta.
Why is that person here? So, and distance was no protection. Willow Grove, an African Canadian community, halfway between St. John and St. Martin's. I think there was a fatality there. Even found in the register of deaths, a woman died on Navy Island. So being on an island in the harbor, which was not Partridge Island, by the way, it was a small island inhabited by fishing families. That was no protection.
Yeah, so there was no way to run from this within the city. Well, I shouldn't say that. It just it depends on where you went and what type of water supply you had. But they did not know that at the time. No. So we finally had the epidemic declining in late August. And the last death was recorded on September the 12th. At the end, at least 1,100 people died. Some estimate as high as 1,500 people. That is a good portion. That's 5% of the entire population of the city dead.
Yes. Yeah. Some of the individual cases, to put names to these statistics, a lot of them are elderly people, they're children. People are dying in institutions such as the almshouse or the so-called lunatic asylum, the mental hospital, or even the penitentiary. Sad case of Duke Street, a family by the name of Buston. The mother named Sally passed away, and her sons Henry and Edward, who were only 4 and 6 years old, were all recorded in the book on July 16th as having passed away.
That's a sad story. And then it does highlight, too, that it spread outside of what would be considered the poorer neighborhoods. Duke Street would not have been considered poor at the time. So it would have gone right into the face of the prevailing medical theory.
Yeah. And one thing I found interesting looking at the register of deaths for both St. John and Portland, there are very few deaths recorded in Carleton, the west side. And I found that interesting. Maybe it wasn't as densely populated, but also as a former West Sider, I know that part of the West Side it runs downhill. A lot of people are living on hills, so maybe they're not living in the low-lying areas. So who knows? But it seemed to be a safer place to be. Carleton on the west side in 1854.
Which I think, Greg, is an awesome segue into our first discussion topic. What is cholera?
Yep.
So let's understand what is going on with cholera. So the first thing, as a lawyer, I love saying Latin stuff. We love dead languages. So disease gives me an opportunity to speak a little Latin. So the disease is caused by certain strains of the bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. and it is transmitted. And this is not going to be pretty, okay?
No.
For any sensitive listeners out there, this is not going to be pretty when we explain what cholera, how it's transmitted, and how the results of it. But we have to inform. We're here to inform. So it is transmitted from human to human through the fecal oral route. So it is a disease that causes massive diarrhea.
Mm-hmm.
And the person will excrete, and we'll get into like how massive it is. Mind-blowing as far as how massive it is. But it goes from the excrement of a person, and then that goes into the drinking water. And then the drinking water, if it's consumed by a person who is healthy, will get a full dose of the cholera bacterium. This can happen with drinking contaminated water. It can happen with the eating of fruits and vegetables washed in water contaminated by cholera. It can come through shellfish. I don't know if that was a factor in St. John, because there would have been certainly people eating shellfish and maybe from the harbor possibly. But the primary one would be drinking water and vegetables and fruits washed in that water. And this is, I find, extremely interesting. So I'm going to nerd out here, is understanding this bacterium. So the Vibrio cholerae bacterium alone is benign. It is fine. But Vibrio cholerae, this strain of it, has been infected by a virus. So the bacteria has been infected by a virus. Now you go, okay, well, it's the virus that's causing disease in humans. No, it's not. The virus causes the bacterium to excrete a toxin called cholera toxin. And the toxin is actually what infects people and gives them the disease. So it is a bacterium wrapped up in a virus carrying a toxin. So that is like a marriage, a biological marriage, perfect marriage of bacterium and viruses coming together in toxins. So what happens is it gets into your system. So we talked about that through the oral route, and it gets through, but one won't do it, Greg. Two won't do it. You need 100 million bacterium payload to even have a hope of infecting the host. And then it has a wild ride. It has to go through the stomach. Stomach's a very hostile environment. It's very acidic. So the bacterium carrying its virus, which carrying its toxin, has to make it through the stomach to the small intestine. And that's where the damage happens. So if it makes it there, it's going to start binding to the cells of the small intestine. And then the reaction that happens when it binds, it starts the cells excreting a massive amount of water, of sodium, of potassium, and bicarbonate. And how much water is being excreted from your small intestine through this process?
Well, an infected person could expel lots of water, measured, by weight.
Give us the liters. How many liters per hour? Once I said liters per hour, that should have been the alarm to everyone going, whoa, that's a lot of water. That we have to actually measure it in liters per hour.
I wouldn't hazard a guess.
1 liter per hour. And this is... There's so many facts of this podcast. I don't know which one is going to win. But what it results in is as much as 44 pounds of water loss in a day. 44 pounds. You can imagine how people didn't survive long with massive, that kind of dehydration.
Massive dehydration in a short period. Right.
Yeah, so that's being excreted in diarrhea, maybe vomiting, but that's a lot of water loss.
And of course, what is coming out of the victims or the patients is adding to the problem.
Big time. 44 pounds being added potentially to drinking water, just full of the bacterium that could get spread again through the fecal oral route. So you have that happening. So you're getting infected. You're excreting this mass amount of water that's getting into the drinking water, all that. And then what happens to the human body when you have that kind of loss? Well, the first thing is our bodies want equilibrium. So if one part of our body is going to be excreting that much water from other parts of our body will go in and try to replace it. So that's why we have those kind of symptoms, the bluish skin, the sunken eyes, the pruning of the hands and the feet, the person resembling a corpse. It's because of that extreme dehydration. And the symptoms can begin as soon as a few hours after infection. And death can actually occur a few hours after infection. But here's the thing, and this gets us back to the Blanche and what they did on Partridge Island. Does everyone who gets infected by the bacterium, do they become symptomatic?
Well, no, and also, not everyone who's exposed will become infected, and then not everyone who's infected will be asymptomatic.
Exactly. So approximately 25% become infected, but there's asymptomatic transmission. So could those members of the Blanche, the passengers of the Blanche, that they go, hey, you look fine, come to St. John, they could have been asymptomatic and spreading the cholera bacterium around the city of St. John.
Yes, and again, our thoughts immediately go to COVID, right?
Yeah, and the thoughts go to COVID, and this is a fact that we have to know is when you become severely affected, so 25% of people exposed to this amount of payload of bacterium will become infected. And of those, if it's left untreated, which it would have been in St. John in 1854, 50 to 70% will die.
Yeah.
So they will die from this. Now, the modern treatment, if treated, it has less than a 1% mortality rate. And I always thought when I was looking at this, okay, well, the modern treatment will be antibiotics. It's a bacteria, antibiotics. Yeah, you can do antibiotics. You can do that. And they try to do that to lessen the severity of the symptoms. But actually what it is the modern treatment is rehydration and electrolytes. Yeah. That'll do the trick. And what they go, you lost 44 pounds. They actually measure how much you're losing per hour. And they go, okay, we're going to give you equal amount back. Okay. And it will run its course because the bacteria will eventually die within that environment and the disease will run its course. But the thing is, they didn't know that. And just before we move on, there has been 7 worldwide pandemics of cholera since 1817. So 7. When did the 7th one end?
Wasn't it only in the early 20th century?
Greg, you're in it.
In it now. Sorry. Yes.
We're in it
developing
now.
World. In the developing world.
So it's still considered pandemic. It started in 1961. I haven't lived in a world that didn't have a cholera pandemic. Wow. And it's still going today, and it's actually on the rise since 2021. Industrialized nations, not so bad. Other places, it is rampant, and there is still a high death toll because of cholera. But let's go back. And what made St. John so susceptible to a cholera outbreak?
Well, 19th century, it was partly the geography and the housing and the poverty, but also the medical knowledge. There was a kind of a lack of understanding about the disease and how it was spread. And so if you don't understand the disease and how it's spread, then you don't know how to prevent it or treat it.
And can you tell us about miasma?
Well, miasma, great word, by the way. Miasma was, I think it was a dominant theory by doctors, professors of medicine, public health people in England and other places in the 1850s, this idea that these types of epidemic diseases are spread by bad air, rotting vegetables, garbage, animal carcasses, things like that, stagnant pools of water. So they didn't understand germ theory as we would know it now. And so, but there were some benefits to this because it did, some of the outcomes would be improving sanitation, cleaning things up, right? But they felt that cholera was one of those airborne diseases, not understanding the link with the human waste, the water system, the gastrointestinal type of disease, right?
Yeah,
And
so cleanliness was good. I like cleanliness, but
Yes.
it depends on what you were cleaning.
Yeah. And of course, and also, you have to think we did have things like the Board of Health and medical officers and things like that, but government, they probably thought their healthcare system was pretty modern, obviously, but government was not as professional and as involved in the lives of the citizens in the 1850s as it would be now.
They were not. So, as one of the first things you said, it was the lack of understanding of the disease, and there were medical professionals who believed it was contagious, but they were by far in the minority. The majority believed it was not contagious. That, as you said, it was this miasma. It was something in the air mixed with this. And it's always good to blame the people who fall ill, and it's mixed with personal frailties, like intemperance, like improper diet, like self-medication. That's a bad one. Or, Greg, spread by giving way to unreasonable fear.
Right. So not keeping the stiff upper lip.
You fear it coming, you'll get it.
So again, this, not for the first or the last time, unfortunately, people, kind of victim blaming. We'll see this during the Irish famine and other outbreaks of disease and famine, blaming the poor, blaming the sick for their own situation. And it's kind of a moral judgment. If only they had better morality, if they took care, took care of themselves in a more middle class way. And again, the other thing about St. John, we're all often joking about our fog, and we know the ocean breeze and the harbor. So many thought that, well, we're on the ocean, we have that breeze coming in, the fog, all these sorts of things are going to protect us from the bad vapors,
bad vapors, the miasma.
And the tides, and also the tides flush out the harbor twice a day. And of course, the other thing that was literally fatal was that experts, most of them, did not believe that cholera was contagious from one person to the next.
No,
right?
No, they believed in the air, coupled with personal frailties. Now, that brings us back to that policeman who was the first victim of cholera in St. John, and that threw that theory into chaos. And so much so is when this person who was known as being temperate, all of these kind of things, living clean, was not poor, did not fit any one of these things, did not give in to unreasonable fear, nothing like that. He died. People were like, no, he didn't. Yeah. He didn't die from cholera. And they required an autopsy to confirm. And then it came back, confirmation, no, he died from cholera. And everyone was like, that, well, but miasma and personal frailties, how is this so? But they ignored that case and kept on going on with, no, this is not contagious. And there were some benefits. And, we kind of got a little taste of when we were going through COVID and the politics behind this, and saying, like, one theory over another theory might have some economic benefits. So what we had was there was political and economic reasons that supported going, cholera was not contagious, because if cholera was contagious, then that would really impact commercial shipping. Right. If you go, well, we have a pandemic, we have potential of a contagious disease, we're going to have to quarantine all vessels going into St. John until such time as you can clear it, that no one on board is suffering from this in any way. So I can imagine there was political pressure to support the medical community on the side of the it's not contagious over the contagion theory.
Yeah, if you shut the port down, you're basically shutting the city down.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to go lightly. They would have wanted hard medical fact before going with that, and they just didn't have it. But Lieutenant Governor Edmund Head did take some precautions. What precautions did he take?
He urged, a cleanup campaign, pigs and other animals. I mean, I'm not sure this is done by provincial legislation or local, but pigs and other animals were banned from city limits. A lot of working class people did keep pigs and other barnyard animals, in the city. And some early intervention, certain people who had been detected as cholera sufferers, house-to-house visits by I'm not sure if this is a board of health or volunteers, going house-to-house looking for people suffering from cholera, and then the setting up of dispensaries for medications. But again, that's an interesting thing because the medications are being sort of set up based on a wrong theory, but I guess it's to treat symptoms.
Well, maybe to treat symptoms. And remember, the proper treatment of it is water, clean water, and electrolytes. And we'll see some of these medicines and tell me if it has anything to do, if it would actually hydrate someone or give them electrolytes. And I would say no. So you have Governor Edmund Head. He's coming in. Cleanliness is good, right, Greg?
Yes.
Like nothing wrong with that, but the cleanliness of what? And, pigs and other animals banned from the city. Probably having a lot of animals and animal waste. Not a good thing for health. But again, not going to be focusing toward cholera. And then let's bring the miasma back into it. What did they do to try to purify the air? Well, besides the tides and besides the ocean breeze and all that, those natural things.
Well, you've got those bad vapors. You start burning barrels of tar in the streets. You ask residents, people are doing this. Maybe they're spreading lime on their properties or whitewashing in their houses. Who knows? But the belief that smoke in itself cleared the air of cholera, right? So, as if there wasn't enough smoke in St. John.
There we go.
People burned wood and coal, and houses were covered in grime, factories. So again, but to be fair, if your prevalent belief is it's airborne, then you're going to try to do something to the air. Right?
Yeah, and they did, and it did not work because, of course, it was focused on the wrong thing and just probably made things way more unpleasant for the people who were suffering from cholera in the city. But those were the understandings of cholera and how it spread. Now we have to move to sanitation. Now, with sanitation, there are different views of different historians on how bad St. John was from a sanitation point of view. So we have some that have described it as, I like this line, it was described as the urine of the inhabitants and animals, about 5 million gallons a year, dissolved by the manure of man and beast. That this was basically raw sewage throughout the streets of St. John. That's how bad things were. And according to this historian, they didn't even improve that much. There were methods to try to get them to improve after the cholera outbreak. But the thing that actually came in and improved things was the Great St. John Fire of 1877 and the need to rebuild the infrastructure and look at sanitation and waterways and stuff like that. So that was one person's view. But any thoughts on how unclean was St. John at the time?
Well, on the other side of the equation, you did have one of the early water companies in Canada, I believe, was incorporated, but this was for a profit company, initially St. John Water Company. So we did have like an early waterworks. I don't know all the details of how that was distributed to people, but then, the flip side of the issue is like the lack of sewage and the lack of what the Victorians would have called water closets or toilets and things like that. The water probably didn't get to the poor areas. People had to buy their water in buckets. Maybe they'd use rainwater for washing, and that gets into certain problems as well. I mean, some people might have used community wells. Still, there was community wells in poor areas. But anyway, companies started bringing water in for Lily Lake in the late 1830s for those who could afford it. And later, Little River in East St. John.
The rich could have water directed right at their house, so they could have a water line going directly to their home. And I believe there was some sewage.
Yes.
Again, richer people would have the better sewage system, and they would live on higher ground, which would have been better for a cholera thing. As we talked about the lower ground, that's where water is going to settle. But then in some of the poorer areas, you wouldn't have quite the sewage system. You could have open sewer. So those would be like little tracks, essentially, little tracks to direct the water towards either the sludge pool that was Mill Pond, that was down by that inner harbor area, by York Point, or straight into the harbor. So that would go down, but you have open sewage going through those poorer areas when you're in a cholera outbreak, and people might be contributing 44 pounds of cholera water to that per day, each of one of those victims. So you got a problem there. Then you have a problem with getting clean water. I read that 2 buckets would cost you a penny. To buy clean water from some sort of supply. That would have been really expensive for the poor people to do. So you wouldn't be really inclined to be parting with a penny for water. You'd be going, let's find a well that might be open, or maybe a charitable person that opened up once a day. They would open up the valve and allow the poor people to get water. But you have a bunch of people around there, again, cholera potentially coming from their clothes, all of this kind of stuff into that and getting spread around.
And think again. Sorry, Mark. Think again about, remember in 2020 when apparently people were not washing their hands? So that was in 2020.
That was in 2020.
So who was washing their hands in 1854, and how often and with what? You didn't have any hot water in your house. And using lye soap. So, and then, night soil. There's another nice Victorian term, night soil. Mark, you want to talk about that?
I want to talk about night soil. So I have to use the facilities in the middle of the night, maybe a number 1 and maybe a number 2. What am I going to do? I'm going to put it in a bucket by my bed. I'm going to put it in a bucket and go, Green will deal with that in the morning. And how will Green deal with it? Likely throw it out the window. So
backyard.
Maybe backyard.
Alleyway.
Alleys were very popular, out of sight, out of mind. So pour that in. So you get all of this excrement around on the streets of the city. So that was a problem. So we have a lot of things with sanitation that did not work well in the throes of a cholera outbreak, when we know that now. And again, I'm not getting down on our 18th century ancestors, or rather 19th century ancestors, but there wasn't the understanding. So all of this was contributed. Let's talk about weaknesses in government. So what we had at the beginning, what we had in 1854, St. John was booming. So we had talked about St. John in the York Point riot, and things were really bad economically, but it turned around because of the Crimean War. So there was a demand now for New Brunswick products and wood and all those kind of things. So it turned around. That caused a huge disparity between the working class, which kept the same wages. Greg, economy is booming. Do they get the benefit of the booming economy with increased wages? No. So they end up suffering more because of the rising cost of living and making the same wages. So they're jammed into the Portland slums. They're jammed into the York Point slums around Mill Pond, where, again, lowland areas where a lot of the drainage of the city is going toward these areas. And then what did local government do to respond to this once they knew cholera is in St. John?
A new board of health. There had been boards of health before, but a new board of health, which was large, and it seldom agreed on things. But you have to remember, there were professionally trained doctors in the city at this time who had received some of the best medical training available in Scotland and places like that. But again, the reach of government just was not as extensive as it is today. The new board tended to defer decisions. They discussed building a cholera hospital, but they ran into the NIMBY system. Where are they going to put it? Who wants a hospital with people suffering from cholera?
Not by me.
In their neighborhood. Yeah, and this happened in other cities as well when there were cholera epidemics and typhoid epidemics and things like that. And there was one attempt to cite a hospital. I ran into some violent opposition. So in the end, Mark, they used something up in Fort Howe hill, right?
Barn that was barely holding together to basically bringing people to die. The little treatment was being done, like they were looking at some treatment, and the Board of Health did eventually get their stuff into line and produce something. Like originally, it was the complaint about the Board of Health was they were not releasing information. They were keeping quiet. We don't want to spread fear, so we're not going to talk about the numbers of deaths in St. John. And what happens when you put people into an information vacuum, Greg? Do they just go, oh, everything's fine, or do they write their own narratives?
Rumors, conspiracy theories, exaggerations. And again, that issue of not releasing official statistics, that happened during COVID too in certain jurisdictions, right? Mm-hmm. So controversial at the time. Yeah. So, but eventually, however, the board did go public with the stats,
and they did, and they printed out a pamphlet on cholera precautions. And let's just read through some of these precautions, and now knowing the disease, and see if any of these could actually really help. You were to apply heat and induce sweating. I'm dying of a disease that's causing dehydration. Do I want to be inducing sweating?
No. You're already sweating.
I'm already sweating. Yeah. Doused with an alcohol and opium. I don't think it was internally taken, but it was some kind of bomb.
They drank it.
They drank it? Did they drink it?
Yep.
Okay, well, that's not going to help. Alcohol and opium, well, opium might help the pain, but it would not help with dehydration, rather. No. Brandy, prevention with cleanliness and careful diet, no salads and fruits. It's interesting that they went no salads and fruits. They had something there. I don't think they understood the reason why. But they go, well, for some reason, salad and fruits are not sitting well with people. It was because of what they washed it with. They washed it with cholera water and no liquor. So, no liquor. I'll get that. Except
for the medicinal brandy.
Yeah,
they probably meant is don't sit around all day and drink beer and whiskey, right?
Yeah, but brandy is medicinal, so that's not alcohol. So those are the things that they did, and then they were directed so that the city councilors, I'm not sure the term back then, I don't think they were called city councilors, but they were told to go around to your areas and make sure that these health codes were being followed. And what they said was, that's below our station.
Right.
We are not doing that. So doctors were hired to go around and provide advice to people suffering from cholera and give them medicine, but they kind of half-heartedly fulfilled that. There were some stories of people using kind of makeshift bullhorns to keep their distance and explain, you want to do this. What?
Yeah.
You want to do this. You want more opium, more brandy. I didn't quite hear that. And people using long sticks to hand medicine through the window of the infected family. But, I'm not going to get too hard on anyone because they didn't know what was going on. And it's life and limb, right, at this time.
Mark, one question just popped into my head. So where were the public health nurses?
They weren't around at the time.
They didn't exist. Oh.
They didn't, but maybe after this.
Yeah.
Maybe after this. So all of those kind of things happened, and then they focused on the wrong problem, didn't they, Greg? They were just going, it's like these filthy animals.
Yes.
The actual filthy animals in the slaughterhouses that were right in the middle of the city. We got to get rid of those. And there was a huge opposition. So they set up a public slaughterhouse outside of the city and said, go use this. And local merchants said, we don't have to. You can't make us do this. We want to use the local ones.
Yeah.
And so there was a big fight about that. And then once the rumor started spreading that was what was causing everyone to die was slaughterhouses, then residents, Prince William Square area, they tried to tear down a slaughterhouse. So we almost had a mob riot. Again, another mob riot in St. John, tearing down a slaughterhouse. So you had all those kind of things. And then you had the city morgue. That was located right by the jail, so close to where the courthouse is today. Yes. And the smell coming from that,
Yeah.
from all the dead bodies piling up, even the prisoners, even the people in the jail, not just the residents around
Next
that
door.
area, they complained about the smell.
Yeah, the courthouse and the jail and the so-called dead house were all beside one another. But, people used to go to this morgue or dead house to look at the dead bodies as entertainment.
Yes.
Imagine how busy that would have been. I mean, you go through that register, you see how many people are dying in a day, and some of them are not even being reported by a doctor. They were being reported by the police.
Mm-hmm.
People tell the police, "We've got a dead person here." The doctor doesn't even pronounce on the cause of death.
So we have this. We have the causes of why it got so bad in St. John: lack of understanding of cholera, sanitation, government response. Now, how did the city change after the outbreak?
Well, there were some economic losses, despite the attempt to stay open for business. People were cautious. People got out of town, as you mentioned, and so there were losses for businesses. And of course, the poor suffered because they suffered from lost wages. Right? They're relying on they're working class people relying on wages, sometimes day laborers. There are a number of children who are orphaned. I mean, children die, but also parents died. So orphans were doled out to Protestant and Catholic, as the practice at the time. Speaking of Catholic Church, the Sisters of Charity were asked to come to St. John by Bishop Thomas Connolly, the local Catholic bishop, and that they became a very important presence in the city for decades to come. So they came to help the children and eventually the poor of the city. Some people were taken to the almshouse, which is like where the poor, it was like the poor law. Right,
which wasn't suitable for poor people, let alone children.
That's
and
right.
Children were being housed at the almshouse.
Yeah, and then children, those who weren't put in orphanages, were boarded out. Which is again another before formal orphanages were set up, boarded out as almost like a cheap labor to families, right? And again, inadequacies of local government and local health measures were exposed. At least that was one thing that came out of this.
Yeah, the people had a lot to answer for after. And the other thing is we had no hospitals in St. John at the time. There was no public hospitals. There might have been a marine hospital here and a military hospital, but there was no general public hospital. So that brought the cry from the citizens of St. John, we need a public hospital. Yeah. So it started the conversation, but we didn't get one until 1865. Yeah, that was a long time.
Yeah, and again, because of the Protestant Catholic thing, that delays any of these projects as well, because eventually the Catholics will start their own hospital, right? Mm-hmm. And that system will remain in place that, if you're a Protestant, you go to this hospital. If you're Catholic, you go to the other one.
Yes, and so the city did prepare for the return of cholera. Cholera, not number 2, because this was not the first cholera epidemic in St. John. We had one 20 years before this in 34, I believe. It was exactly 20 years. But they were expecting, 1855 is going to be bad. So they got ready for it, and it never happened. And I would not say it was because of the precautions taken. It never happened. The cholera pandemic ran its course worldwide around that time. So we just didn't have it come back. But the commission suggested, because there was commissions that were brought together to talk about, okay, what do we do about this? And there was calls for better sewers, better drains, better water supplies. And this is not just to deal with cholera. This is to deal with domestic needs and fire prevention. And so there was a lot of those kind of things. But then there was a lot of fighting because the people who had to pay for it often were the people of means, and they going, well, why should I have to pay for something that someone else is getting a benefit? I have done a lot with my private system on my land, and now you want me to contribute to a public system? My private system is fine. What is a public system going to do? Benefit people who will not pay for it. So there was a lot of fighting about who should be paying for this increase and this upgrading of the sewer and water system.
Yeah, keep in mind, too, you probably know this, Mark, that St. John was a city where in many neighborhoods, 80% of the people rented from landlords. Mm-hmm. Right. So what landlord is going to want to spend all that money?
Well, exactly. And then we brought in the creation of the health police. to go around and start to enforce public health guidance on cleanliness and dealing with that night soil issue, that horrible night soil issue. And of course, they were met with open arms, weren't they, Greg?
A lot of resistance.
Of resistance. Violence.
Yes. What do you mean I can't keep my pig in my house?
Yeah.
Right.
How dare you?
It's kind of an assault on the working class lifestyle. And
in all fairness, too, they didn't have an option. No. They said, don't do this. Okay, well, what am I going to do? I need to keep some animals, but I need to provide for my family. What's the option? Health police? Don't do it. Follow the law. Okay, thank you very much. And then we had ones that were shut down. So apartment buildings were shut down. Well, they weren't shut down. They said, you clean this up. You need to clean up this mess, or we are shutting you down. And what did people do? They left. They just abandoned it because they couldn't do it. They couldn't meet the health guidance. So you have those kind of things happening. You had the Board of Health try to move the problem of night soil outside the city, but then they were criticized for moving one problem from one area and causing a problem to another area. So that didn't work. But eventually the city did recover from the epidemic at a remarkable pace, actually. So even though business had essentially shut down in the entire city for a period of 4 months, economically, St. John did better in 1854 than it did in 1853. That's how strong business was. Yeah. And this is the sad fact of the podcast is it's speculated why it bounced back so quickly is because primarily it was the poor people who died and were impacted by this disease. And besides the people who loved them, they were not seen as a vital part of the city's economy. And the city just goes, we'll get by. We move on, bigger and better things. That is now behind us.
Yeah. Well, so they're kind of seen as socially and economically expendable at a time when other parts of the community were thriving.
That's the podcast and proof, Greg. St. John, nothing happened here.
Thank you for listening to St. John, Nothing Happened Here. To learn more, join us at www.nothinghappedhere.ca or connect with us on Facebook. Other means of communication include, but are not limited to, telegrams, smoke signals, and carrier pigeons. However you want to reach us, we want to hear from you.